Well, it's great to see you again, Bill. We were just together in Copenhagen, and I want to talk to you about Copenhagen and where the United States stands on global warming. But since there are a number of students in the audience, I thought we should start where you began, and then follow the trajectory of your life. Where were you born?
You know what? We're not even going to start there. I only get to see you ever in the sort of 10 minutes before we're doing your show, and it's always, you know, makeup people running around, and I want to. So I never get to. I just want to say, in public, just how incredibly grateful I am for your work for the last long time. Now, there was a moment in the early years of the Bush administration when I just about gave up on journalism and journalists as people were just rolling over. And in the electronic media, there were three people: Bill Moyers, Jon Stewart, Amy Goodman, kept doing actual journalism in the face of the unbelievably overwhelming consensus that we should just stop doing asking tough questions and get in line and whatever. And so for everything, but especially that, maybe eternally grateful. So where was I born? California. And then my father was a journalist, so we moved around, and I lived in Toronto for 5 years, went to elementary school there, and then to Massachusetts for high school, and then to college down the road in Cambridge.
You were the editor of the Harvard Crimson.
I was.
And then went on to be the youngest staff writer of the New Yorker magazine.
I wrote the Talk of the Town for 5 years, the last 5 years of Bill Shawn's reign as editor of the New Yorker. In the days when Talk of the Town was different, then it was A, anonymous, which I really liked, and B, the one rule was you weren't allowed to write about anybody famous. You know, it wasn't about what was in the news. It was about people who weren't famous. It was a great job. I loved it, every minute of it.
So I wanted to talk about these moments of change and courage. For some, being a staff writer at the New Yorker would be the culmination of their career. You hit it very early. And then when Bill Shawn left, you left with him. You didn't have to. Why did you make that decision? I mean, you had a platform that millions would read your writing.
Well, they fired him. I mean, and that's what happened. I mean, they sort of didn't quite call it that, but Cy Newhouse bought the New Yorker, and that was the crucial moment. And it was clear to me that there was, you know, that it wasn't going to be the same for a very long time. It's now emerged on the other side as a pretty darn good magazine again. So I was just, as often as the case, just got angry, and but in retrospect, I think some part of my 27-year-old self knew that this was a chance to get out of what's, could have been a kind of velvet prison in a lot of ways, and to strike out for the woods and to learn how to do entirely different things without the imprimatur of the New Yorker behind me.
And talk about what you did.
I moved to the Adirondacks, to the one great wilderness in the American East, moved deep into the woods, and fell in love with it in a just incredibly visceral way. And was spending an immense amount of time outdoors. And at the same time, I was reading the earliest papers and things about climate change, and beginning to understand that this place that was so wild and that meant so much to me in its wildness, in a sense, wasn't as wild as I had understood, or was changing rapidly. And that kind of shock and sadness, more than sort of fear or worry, was the animating principle behind The End of Nature, this sort of first account of climate change that came out in now a long time ago, 1989.
I mean, it was astounding. Why did you call it the end of nature?
Well, at the time, there hadn't been an endless list of books called like the end of history and the end. I mean, now it was sort of a cliche. At the time, it seemed like a kind of pleasantly shocking notion. But the argument was not that nature itself is coming to an end. If anything, it's going to be more a factor in our lives than it's been in the past. It was this idea of nature as something independent of human beings was no longer, if it had ever been tenable, was no longer so. Since then, I've spent 20 years learning about things like the effect on poor people around the world, of climate change, the effect on military conflict, the effect on, on and on and on and on. Probably better reasons, in a sense, to worry about climate change and to spend one's life working on it. But for me, the very beginning of that was simply that sense of deep sadness I felt about these places that meant so much to me.
And it really struck a chord with so many. It was translated into scores of languages. Yep. How did that affect you? This was the opposite of what you'd been living. You'd been living in the wilderness. You were very much alone. And suddenly, world acclaim for your book and your ideas.
The good thing about selling a lot of books is that it allows you then to write the next one and maybe the next 2 or 3 without, they'll just sort of publish them, And that's kind of the deal. As long as you can sell enough books, then you get to write about what you want to write about it in the way you want to write about it. So for me, that was a great luxury.
But you were starting a very big conversation that with tremendous foresight, talking about, for many that was the first time they started to think about it.
And of course, since I was 27 or 28, at the time, I was operating under the illusion that it would, that people would read a book and then they would, things would begin to change, and this, people would take note of this problem and to work we would go. And I wasn't very politically sophisticated in that way, I think. And it took me a long time to figure out that I was actually probably going to have to figure out how to do some political organizing too if I wanted any hope of, actually affecting this, which I very much didn't do want.
Talk about the next book, The Age of Missing Information.
Well, one of the questions that came up in my mind as I was doing this is why it's so difficult for us to grapple with this. Here we know now about the biggest problem we've ever faced, and we're not doing anything about it, so why is that? And I wanted to kind of figure out how our kind of worldview was being shaped. So this would have been 1992 or something, and I found the largest cable TV system in the world at the time, which was in Fairfax, Virginia. It had 100 channels. So I got people to tape for me everything that came across them for a 24-hour period. So I had 2,400 hours worth of video tape. A sort of snapshot of a day in the life of the information age, kind of pre-internet. And took it home with me to the mountains. I went to Sears and bought a recliner, and settled in for a year, sort of like this, a little more comfortable. And settled in and spent a year basically watching TV.
So it took you a year to watch
About
a day?
I was watching 8 hours a day, which is altogether too close to the American average, frankly, to be comfortable. And my sort of question was, what would the world look like to you if this was the lens through? Because we're the first couple of generations of human beings for whom more of our primary experience of the world is mediated. There's always been media. There's always been books, songs, plays, odes, whatever. But it's relatively recently that comprises more of the hours of the day than actual contact with the natural world or other human beings. And the message finally, there's the books filled with lots of different insights, and it was pretty interesting. But the key one in the end, if you boil it all down, is we've got a consumer society through its organs, most importantly television, trying to tell us 24 hours a day that we're the most important thing in the world, that we're the center of the universe. You sitting there with the remote in your hand. And that's an incredibly powerful message, and anti-ecological, and anti-theological, and anti-social in its deepest sense, and very, very profound, I think. And it allowed me then to ditch the television without ever having to feel like I was an intellectual snob. I'd given it its due. You weren't on TV back then. You were just, but Bill Moyers was about the one thing on TV, and I figured that, I could probably do that, get Bill Moyers without having to get the rest of the package.
What did you like the most on television? What did you hate the most?
The Moyers, the 1 hour of Moyers that was there was the one thing that really stuck out in the whole day. I mean, aside from that, TV has one great virtue, its ability to show you live things. So the only time of the year I miss TV is, Winter Olympics and Red Sox season. So I go to the bar if there's a really important game, and that's good. I was lucky that I was doing this before the advent of reality TV, so-called, because that would have driven me crazy even beyond there's something about it that just encapsulates. I mean, think about a situation where you put, like Survivor was the first of these, right? You put 10 people on it's only in America with your response to being on a desert island being, how quickly can I get rid of everybody else and be here by myself? It's just insane.
Could you imagine how interesting it would be to have a survivor, for example, in Detroit? Right, what it means to live on so little, with unemployment at 50%, and really learn about, or they did one in Indonesia, I think, but actually being a worker in a Nike plant in Indonesia.
But of course, the response, if you were actually planning to survive in the real world, your response would be to get together with other people to do something, If you were actually there with Donald Trump on The Apprentice, the only rational response would be to form a kind of apprentice union, and try to prevent, but that's not, our cult of hyper-individualism is so large that.
So how did you come up with the title, The Age of Missing Information?
That I can't remember. But I guess the idea was just that we keep pretending to ourselves that we live in this thing called the information age, but actually, we know far less than people of other times and places about how to do particular things, get our food or build our shelter or whatever, but more importantly, how to work with other people to do something, which has always been the sort of single basic human skill, our sort of social ability, the thing that almost defined us as human beings. And we've largely lost it.
Hope, Human, and Wild was next.
Well, you've got a better list than I do. Yeah, it was an attempt to be a little. David Brower said to me, having read The End of Nature, the great longtime head at Sierra Club, great environment, said, well, we need to restore and repair and renew. So write something about that. So I looked for optimistic things and found what I could. Places that were doing things differently than we were doing. And there weren't as many as there should have been, but I wrote about Kerala in India, an amazing place, and about Curitiba in Brazil, one of the most interesting cities in the world. And I wrote about the natural recovery of the forests of the American East, my neck of the woods.
And these places, why did they have such a low carbon imprint?
Well,
is that
partly it was because they were. What was interesting about a place like Kerala or Curitiba was that they weren't making strong efforts to be green. What they were doing was providing good lives for people, concentrating mostly on taking care of poor people, and in the process building states and cities that worked on all kinds of levels, you know. What was interesting about Carolyn was that, you know, it had, its life expectancy and its infant mortality and things were the same as ours, but they were doing it on $300 a person a year. So they were having essentially no environmental impact, you know, and yet they were leading lives that were clearly working in many ways. Their literacy rate higher than ours, including their female literacy rate, you know, on and on and on.
Maybe one. We're skipping a few, but maybe one. And it also follows your life.
It was a book about population, and the argument was that we usually locate the problem in the wrong place. When we think about population, it's always brown-skinned people someplace having too many babies. If you're worried about something like climate change, it doesn't matter how many Tanzanians there are, because they don't use enough resources to materially affect the climate. I mean, I just saw the statistics. The average American family uses more energy between the stroke of midnight on New Year's Eve and dinner on January 2nd than the average Tanzanian family uses in the course of a year. Okay? So the problem is close to home. Americans consume at an enormous rate. If we had as many Americans having single-child families as two-child families, if that was just as common a choice, then we could have historically high levels of immigration, and our population would still peak instead of, we're going to go up another 50% or so in the course of the next 5 decades in this country. That's another 150 million Americans. That's a lot of Americans, you know, consuming the way we consume.
So you had one baby.
I do have one. And she's now 17, so.
You then went into this period of elite training. Explain what you did.
I needed a vacation from failing to save the world, so my great vice in the world is cross-country skiing, which is another reason why I'm always worried about climate change, I think. And I spent a year sort of training at an Olympic kind of level. I never got particularly fast. My genetics are not Olympic caliber, but it was great, good fun, I must say. Unfortunately, the book turned out more to be about the death of my father, or at least as much, because it sort of coincided with his decline, and it was sort of made for interesting if sad writing.
How did you write that?
It's a sort of dual story of my getting stronger while he got weaker, and this sort of becomes a kind of meditation on bodies, on what that means. And the physical world, including the human body, is important to me, and I think in general we live lives of such deep abstraction that we tend to forget the natural world, we tend to forget our own bodies, you know, we tend to forget a lot because what's on the screen or whatever seems more real to us somehow.